the paper is about data sharing by private actors as an avenue for more sustainability. So a little bit of context maybe before diving a little bit deeper. Where did this paper come from? So I wrote my PhD on business to business data sharing. And actually, when you look into the policy discussions around data sharing, quite often the focus is on, economic considerations. We need more competition. We need to create, we need to, for all different actors to be able to get money or value from the data. So that's usually the big one out there. It's, data sharing for economic reasons. But there's also, and that's acknowledged in several of the Commission's documents, data sharing for what I would call sustainability purposes. So, I understand that sustainability is an extremely broad term. So, sustainability or societal purposes, I struggled a little bit with exactly which kind of word I wanted to put in here, but, think about environmental protection, health, mobility, scientific research, etc., which you clearly feel it's not an economic objective. It's something else. It's like a common good, or however you want to call it. And so I focus on this, and I start the paper by giving like several examples, but I maybe just give you one here to make it a bit clear what I have in mind. So in agricultural sector, more and more we talk about smart farming. You have a bunch of sensors, like probably in that tractor, there might not be a ton of sensors, but like in new type of tools, not only in the tractors, but also in the soil, etc. And this kind of data, it could be used for sustainable or common good purposes in two ways. For example, to avoid food waste. Imagine that one sensor in a plot of land of a farmer identifies that actually this crop is starting to suffer from a specific disease. Well, it might be useful to warn the other farmers around, okay, this is happening here. You might want to check your crops or make sure that this doesn't happen to you so it doesn't spread. Also, in terms of environmental purposes, if you have the manufacturers of these smart agro tractors or whatever, that they know exactly how much quantity of pesticides you need to spray on a specific field. Well, if you know exactly what is the relevant quantity and you share this information, well, then you avoid overspraying and you avoid over damaging the environment. So we could have the discussion, is it fine to spray pesticides in the first place? But I'm more like, if we deal with pesticides, maybe we can limit this by sharing data and just sharing what we need. And last point on the introduction is like all of this, so data sharing for common good or sustainable purposes, or however you want to call it, it could be voluntary or it could be compulsory. So of course, different actors could decide to voluntarily try to find an agreement on that, but we can also think about, well, if this doesn't happen, are there cases in which we should force this? And this not only in a business to business situation, but also in a business to government. And so what I try to do based on this background in the paper, so it's, the objective is quite reasonable. I don't want to do too much in this, at least first paper that I have on this. The idea is to say, okay, what's the state of legislation today? If I want to engage in data sharing for societal purposes, what are the instruments there in terms of voluntary sharing and in terms of compulsory sharing? And so in terms of voluntary sharing, well, voluntary sharing mostly it relies on contractual agreements. Because it's voluntary, people are going to decide among themselves, okay, I'm going to share data with X, Y, and Z. We're going to sit around the table. We're going to decide how we want to make this work. Here, what's interesting to point out is that in the Data Governance Act, there's this mechanism that they're creating with this idea of data sharing for the common good, or data altruism, as they call it. And what's interesting to me here is that it's a very peculiar model of voluntary sharing, because actually it's not a direct sharing between different actors that agree, let's do this together, but it's actually a sharing through an intermediary. And the DGA is all about intermediaries, but it's really, you have this intermediary organization that creates itself saying, if you give me your data, I'm going to share it with people for social reasons. So it's not a direct sharing between, for example, Monsanto and the state. It's Monsanto shares with this data altruism organization that has been created for these social spaces, and then that is shared by where eventually the state can go maybe get some data in there. And so it's really interesting to see that it's managed by a data altruism organization, and it's actually quite the criteria to be able to get this logo or this label or however you want to call it is actually quite strict, because you have to be a non-for-profit entity that pursues a general interest objective, and you have to determine in advance what that objective is. For example, I want to do environmental common space, or I want to do health space or whatever. And through a legally independent and functionally separate structure. So really, we have this general idea of the Data Governance Act that if I create an intermediary, I do one thing, I define what it is, and I can't do anything else. In a way, it's interesting, but I think it limits, we always talk bad about big actors like Google, Facebook, because they do a lot of bad stuff. But, if Google wanted to say, hey, with all this money I make, I might want to create this kind of like, altruism organization, and I'm going to have this unit that is going to share some of my data with others for altruism. This is not going to fit in this frame. In itself, it's fine because you can still do it by contracts, but the downside is like all these safeguards and guarantees that are applied around these data altruism organization. It only works if you meet all these conditions, and so it leaves the room for different kind of things on the side. And so it might be interesting to have maybe open this a little bit more. Concretely on the procedure on how to become a data altruism organization, I'm not going to enter too much into detail, but I think what's interesting here is that they have to declare in advance what they're going to do. And also, and that might not really be easy to do at all, which data they're going to need to do so. It's one thing to say, I'm going to collect data for environmental purposes, but defining in advance exactly which data I'm going to need, maybe right now, today, I have a good idea of some of the actors and some of the data out there that might be interesting to me, but it could be that there's data from the future that I don't really know what is going to come out. And if I have to already declare in advance, that might be a little bit problematic. And then once you're registered, the benefit from that is that you can have this data altruism logo. So, maybe that opens the door to some greenwashing and things like that. We can maybe talk about, but the only benefit you actually get is, having this logo. So we can also think about potentially in terms of financing, how this would work. And these organizations, they're going to have to respect some principles in terms of transparency, safeguards requirements, compliance with rule book. I'm not really going to detail here because it's basically the classic stuff when we talk about intermediaries and data. So, defining the purposes in advance, deleting the data if you don't need it, protecting trade secrets, ensuring the security and things like that. So it's quite business as usual in terms of the objective, but I wanted to put a little bit of emphasis on this mechanism because it's quite an interesting mechanism of how we're going to try to do some data altruism or voluntary sharing. Now I want to move to compulsory sharing, because voluntary sharing, it's really nice. And I think it's always good to first try to push the actors to voluntarily decide to do things because they're going to be more motivated and might lead to better things. But, sometimes letting them decide to agree is just not going to lead to the results that you want. And then you think, okay, then what do we do? Are there certain cases where we have to push for this? And actually, you see that when we talk about compulsory sharing for sustainability or societal reason, it's very much focused on business to government, and this kind of is born in 2017, where there was the revision of the Open Data Directive. So it's the other way around, government to business sharing. And in the consultation, we're like, well, open data is working pretty well. Should we do it? Should we consider? At that time, it was called reverse PSI. Should we do it the other way around? And there was a lot of support for it in the public consultation. 88% of the respondents said, well, yeah, actually, that's a good idea. We should do that. And eventually, it was not done because there was strong pushback from actors from the sectors, and it was justified pushback to some extent, saying, well, the objectives are unclear. What's the scope? Like, what is the general purpose? What's a public interest? I mean, this was something that was defined in 2 paragraphs. The whole idea was explained in 2 paragraphs in a public consultation. So it was not really clear where we were going with that. So it was not included in the PSI directive recast. But then a high-level expert group on business to government data sharing was appointed to say, okay, guys, let's This is not such a bad idea. It's maybe a bit too early. It's not mature yet, but let's think about how this could work. And this high-level expert group, they looked into this, and they basically came with 4 principles in terms of proportionality, data use limitation, risk mitigation, and compensation. And I'm not going to delve into this too much, because actually we're going to see that in the Data Act now, these kind of 4 principles or objectives that were voiced by the high-level expert group, they appear now in the Data Act. And so now in the Data Act proposal, you have these articles for business to government data sharing for exceptional need. So of course, here the key term is exceptional need, and there's an exemption for micro and small undertakings. And so you understand from the title that it's actually much more limited than the original idea of, we want B2G for general interest or public interest. Like exceptional need, it's much more limited than public interest. And actually, when you read the impact assessment that accompanies the proposal, the commission said, yeah, we looked into like these broader B2G data sharing, but we think the added value compared to the expected added costs are just not worth it at this point. It's not clear enough. So first, we're gonna do something small on a very specific topic. And probably if we see that it works, we'll extend it down the road. But the result of this is that compulsory B2G, it only exists in exceptional needs. So the first one is to respond, prevent, or assist recovery from a public emergency. So this is, quite clear. Think about an earthquake, potentially a terrorist attack, COVID pandemic, things like that. Emergency situation, we need some data. We might be able in those cases to force some public actors to give data to some private actors to give data to public actors. Then there's the second one, or 15.c, because I grouped A and B together, which I'm really puzzled about, because it's this idea of lack of available data that prevents the public sector body from fulfilling a specific task, and it cannot get the data elsewhere or through other means in a timely manner. But other means being, we could adopt a legislation. So I feel my reading of this article is that as soon as we consider, it's not that urgent, if we can adopt a legislation in a couple of years to solve the problem, then this is always going to bar this Article 15C, because yes, we don't have the data now, but if you agree on this, we can probably find a solution. But so this definition, it made me think, okay, but what about the climate crisis, for example, global warming? Is that a public emergency? Because, there's 2 ways of seeing it. You could look at the IPCC reports from 2 years ago, from last year, from this year. I mean, you could say it's a public emergency. It's time to move. So could we say that we're in this situation? On the other hand, you could say, well, it's urgent, but it's mid to long-term risks that we need to move now. So if the idea is there's an emergency to adopt legislation, but we still have time, I mean, we can discuss whether this is the case or not. There might, to me, and that's the point that I argue in the paper, probably just saying, I want your data to fight against climate change because there's an emergency, I'm not sure this would work. Saying I need your data because there has been a fire or an earthquake or a flood that is a consequence of climate change, and this specific incident I need to address, yes, then in this case you could use the emergency situation. And so here, once you enter this very narrow domain of exceptional needs, then you have these clear rules, clear framework on how this data should be shared, and this is where you can see the work of the high-level expert group that appears in this. And I think it's interesting because these principles, to me, are there to stay, also in a situation where in maybe 3 to 4 years, we decide to say we're actually going to open B2G sharing more. It's not just going to be for exceptional need, but for any general purpose interest, for example. Then the principles are there. So it's more going to be about just the scope of how much you want, but the principles essentially are going to be the same. And again, these are principles that, if you've read the GDPR, or the Data Governance Act, or even the DMA, it's always the same. You need to be transparent about why you're going to need the data. You need to be proportional. It needs to be used for a specific purpose. You need to only use the data that is necessary. There are some obligations regarding reuse. So, if I am a public authority and say, I need this data for this emergency, then I can only use the data for this emergency. I cannot use it for other purposes. Interesting point is that I think they saw that there was potentially a loophole in the situation of, if we get some data for an emergency, we don't want this data to then fall into the open data regime, because if you give it to public authorities, and that's really what the private actors fear, is like, yeah, okay, I don't mind giving my data to you, specific public authority, but what I'm scared of is that, what's going to happen with that data after? Who are you going to give it to? Is this going to end up in my competitor's hand? And so here, this idea to say that the data that is given to public authorities, it doesn't fall in the open data regime. It's a way of clarifying to them, don't worry, this is not going to be further disseminated. And then there are some considerations in terms of remuneration. In short, if it's an emergency and we need to recover, you don't pay for it, but any other situation, there's some costs that can be charged also with some kind of reasonable return on investment. And then finally, and this is my last slide, I think one of the last points that I also wanted to make in the paper is not just only to say, okay, these are the rules, the cross-border, the cross-sectoral rules that exist, because of course there are plenty of sectoral rules where actors have to share with specific sector-specific authorities or sector-specific public administrations. But here I'm really looking at the cross-border framework. And it's very much focused in compulsory on B2G. And the last point I want to make is, like, I think it actually also makes sense to, in some cases, impose it in business-to-business scenarios as well. Think about this idea of the Monsanto or John Deere or whatever that have data about how much pesticides needs to be sprayed. They're not going to want to share that data with other farmers, because of course it's in their interest that farmers overspray, because if farmers overspray, that means that they buy more pesticides from them. So they don't have the interest voluntarily. They're never going to say, well, no, you actually don't need to buy 200 liters, 100 liters is enough. And so here there might be environmental justifications to say, well, actually, is this acceptable? We should maybe force them in some very specific situation to share this data to avoid these environmental issues. And so what's interesting to me is that actually in the Data Act itself, you can see an embryo of this kind of compulsory business-to-business sharing for societal or sustainability purposes. It's not direct, and I'm talking about the IoT data access right. It might not be obvious at first sight, because when we talk about this IoT data access right, it's mainly included for innovation and competition, and that's really the first objectives that are put forward. But actually, when you think about it, well, if the idea is to create more competition on aftermarket services, that also means that if you have more actors, the prices of, for example, repair or maintenance services are going to go down. And because the prices of maintenance and repair go down, as a customer, all of a sudden, it becomes much more interesting for me to actually have my device repaired instead of buying a new one. And so this idea of competition feeds into this idea of generating a more circular economy, of having more sustainable products that can more easily be repaired. So it's not an obviously stated objective, but you can see that there's kind of an embryo there. And to me, this opens the door to potentially other business-to-business data sharing in other scenarios. I'll stop here. I hope it wasn't too much in too little time.
Charlotte, I'm looking to you. I recommend, tomorrow Charlotte's paper, because I think it answers some, or at least shows the problems of some of your points. So, Niccolo.
So, thank you. My name is Nicola Rossetto, and I'm a research fellow here at the Florence School of Regulation in the energy section. And okay, scusate, non petita accusatio manifesta. I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me if I make some mistakes. Well, I read your paper, and I would say I find it very I find it very nice. It's well written, I would say. Is basically a paper where you discuss two legal proposals. Well, by now, one of the two has been adopted, but I assume that a couple of months ago, it was still something in discussion, and also the Data Act actually is something still ongoing. You refer to the various also, let's say, documents that surround the proposal. So I would say it's really a traditional paper in the Iure Condendo. It's definitely a cross-sector paper, and that actually surprised me because at the beginning I thought it was, oh, let's about energy. But actually reading it, you see it's really with a cross-sector approach in mind. And the idea you investigate what are the rules that Europe is adopting to promote the sharing of data and therefore the access to data in order to generate value. And as you said also a few minutes ago, you say there is a lot of discussion about access to data to generate economic value, but we should not forget also this societal value. And actually, so access to data or data sharing to support what you call as a sustainability initiatives or simply sustainability in the title. And then you provide some examples. One of them is about transport, is probably, and the other agriculture that you made. And then you start to describe the various options that you detected in the two legal proposals, but basically it's what you have just said. So this we all know. About, let's say, my critique on the paper, the ambiguous title, because as I said, when I read the title and the abstract a few weeks ago, I said, okay, it can fit energy section. But then by reading the entire paper, I see that the paper speaks about sustainability. But then my question is, what does it mean? What do you mean by more sustainability? And actually, you admit a few minutes ago this, you provide some examples in the introduction, but you fail, or at least I didn't see, to define it. And I think that this is could be a problem, could be actually something hampering you from exploiting more the potential of this research. Because since the concept of sustainability is a bit vague, probably you can argue less in legal terms and, for instance, support in a less clear way the balancing exercise, for instance, that you refer in section 3 in more than one place. So, because since it's not well defined, you cannot activate other levers in the legal order to justify your conclusion or to claim something about how the legal framework in Europe should develop. And similarly, this cross-sector focus is nice, but of course, since it's cross-sector, it inevitably tends to be too abstract and cannot benefit from the advantages of sector-specific rules, because it's really in the sky, and then you have less tools to argue, to develop your arguments. Well, this is more trivial. I would suggest you to reduce the length of the introduction and state even more clearly how you intend to go ahead. It's written at the end, but after 2 pages, maybe the reader got a bit distracted, and also to stress more the methodology. This is a, let's say, a trivial comment. And another, in terms of an approach, maybe you describe too much in section 3, and then you kind of exhaust the space, and you have less space to develop these legal arguments, to maybe investigate the doctrine. I'm not aware, I'm not a lawyer, so I assume that there are tons of papers discussing similar things, and you do not refer to them much, probably could be something that you can develop more by reducing the descriptive component of the paper. Some suggestions. Well, it's actually going the same line of reasoning that I just tell you. If you try to expand more the reference to theory, I assume that probably thinking more in terms of what the public interest is, what can it justify in terms of obligations, it can help you to go farther in supporting the importance, the correct appropriateness of adopting certain choices rather than others at the legislative level. Then another comment, I find nice your reference to IoT access data at the end. And I see that it could be a way to bring back the topic of sustainability. Another one that you do not mention, at least to me, is that actually IoT is essential, or it's very important to support this deep decarbonization of the energy system via sector integration, via what sometimes is called sector coupling. So you combine all the various devices, including those that you find at the premises of final consumers, and by letting them talk, you can exploit more synergies and complementarities in the production, consumption, storage of energy. And this is considered an important pathway for the future deep decarbonization of our economies. And in this sense, it could be another way for you to claim that this possibility will help fostering sustainability. Another thing that you could develop, but I know it's maybe for another paper, is this economic regulation of data altruism organization. You know, we study regulation, so when you start to discuss about remuneration of the cost of this organization, I immediately thought how to remunerate them, how to ensure that they have the incentives to be efficient. But this, I see that, of course, is another type of research probably, but it could be interesting as a follow-up. And then maybe you mentioned also, maybe Matthias, this DAO, this data altruism organization, you clearly mentioned it should be a non-for-profit entity. But what is interaction with, for instance, other for-profit entities that perform still an objective of general interest? And in terms of data, it came to my mind the distribution system operators for electricity or gas, that they manage a lot of data, consumer data. So maybe, but I don't know, it could be interesting to investigate how these two entities and the rules that apply to them interact. But of course, this leads to the final conclusion. Maybe you can develop a more sector-specific analysis, because exactly this DAO and the DSO is something for electricity, for instance. And so it's something that is not relevant in agriculture, for instance, or less in mobility. And yeah, I think with this, it's all. Thank you very much. By the way, it was a very good paper, written very clearly. So.